Das Vidania, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a history podcast hosted by two tits in a basement. I'm joined here today by my good friend Sputnik.
Very good.
Thank you.
You should have saved that before we revealed it.
I should have done. Should I do it again?
No. I think but also, you started by saying goodbye.
Is that goodbye?
Das Vidania is goodbye. So you may have confused quite a lot of people in the opening 30 seconds. Well done. That's a new record.
Well, I know two Russian. Well, I thought I knew two Russian phrases. I know that, and I know "blia" is a rude word.
Right. Okay.
I don't know what it means.
Oh, language skills aside, what on earth are we going to be talking about this week?
In this episode, we're actually going to be talking about the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth.
Yeah, it's going to be another show that's out of this world, quite literally.
Oh.
Yeah. So get ready to blast off into a realm of excitement. I don't even sound... I'm trying to sound excited when I say that. And it just sounds like I want someone to take me out back and shoot me Soviet style.
Is that what this podcast has brought you to?
I'm starting to think you get all your podcast ideas from playing Civilization, though. You just go along the scientific timeline, don't you, and just think, oh, that'll do.
I could do, couldn't I? Yeah. So our next episode is going to be horse archers.
I never build them. Never.
No, I don't do that. I try and hold out for musketmen, I think.
You wait a long time. You must
Yeah.
never get attacked early on in the game.
No.
You probably play on like Prince difficulty, don't you?
I go for very, very quick expansion of the land that's unclaimed. And then when I start butting up against the neighbours, then I'm normally in sort of musketman sort of time period. So I just start farming those.
See, I'm quite conflicted when I play because I'm caught between the idea of just wanting a nice tight city with like maybe 6 cities around me, like a nice enclave, and then at the same time I want to dominate the entire world, which is a bit tricky to have both at once. It's Anyway, the Civilization podcast we're going to do another time.
But yes, so yes, Sputnik. Sputnik is what we're talking about today. So the launch of Sputnik was a major technological achievement, and it showed the world that the Soviet Union was capable of developing advanced technology. And it also was quite a major blow to the United States, who at the time had seen themselves as more of a leader in this field.
Yes, it was actually a colossal sense of arrogance to the Americans, who, despite in the run-up to the launch of Sputnik, which we will go into more detail, there were like continual delays to the Navy's rocket program, because the Navy had been one of the 3 armed forces selected to pursue a rocket program to launch a satellite. And even though there were continual delays and increasing noises coming from the Soviet Union that they were launching more successful rockets, all the Americans were like, yeah, we've still got this in the bag. Like, how can those Soviets beat us? We're Americans, we're great. So it was severely wounded American pride when it kicked off. And those famous rhythmic beeps that we hear emanating from Sputnik will live forever in the archives of history.
Yeah, we'll touch upon this later, but they have become kind of iconic socially, artistically. You sort of hear them pop up in places, especially art from the time.
You also hear them when a truck is reversing.
Yes, it's a subtle little reference to Sputnik, wasn't it? So we're looking at the mid to late 1950s. The political situation between the USSR and the West at the time was quite tense, to say the least, and a little bit unstable. They had been allies in the war not too long ago, and now they were adversaries, rivals.
To call them allies during the war is a bit of a stretch as well.
They were sort of like, what's that?
Expedient.
What's that saying? My enemy's friend is my friend. It was sort of convenient.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, fortunately, the Nazis were out of the way, so as was their reason to be friends. The Cold War was in full swing at this point, and both sides were engaged in both an arms race and a space race. The West was concerned about the Soviet Union's growing military power, and this was fueled by its rapid advancement in development of nuclear weapons. But Sputnik wasn't only good for spooking the Americans, it also sparked a renewed interest in space exploration around the world, and helped to pave the way for future achievements in space travel. Thanks to Sputnik, people started to dream of going to space themselves. So join us as we delve into the history of the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, and the impact it had on the world. Learn how a tiny metal sphere with 4 antennas sparked a space race, inspired countless sci-fi movies, and helped to change the course of human history.
And was also responsible for one of the lamest jokes on an episode of Friends.
What joke was that?
You know when Ross goes to a fancy dress party and dresses as a spud with an antenna in his head? And he says, "I'm Sputnik."
I don't remember that.
No.
I don't remember much of Friends.
That's probably a good thing.
I I caught an episode. It must have been like somewhere in the middle, and I just remember thinking, I don't remember all these people being so unlikable.
Anyway, in order to really understand how we got to a tiny metal spear that would change the world, we kind of need to go back a little bit in time. As with all things in the 20th century, it always leads back to some Nazis. It kind of starts with a sort of tale of two people, actually. So there's a really fascinating book by Deborah Cadbury, who, entitled The Space Race, who sort of charts the sort of this duel between two of the finest, I guess, rocket-based science minds, both on conflicting sides. One was a former Nazi SS officer named Werner von Braun.
Yeah.
And another was, I believe you know, a Russian army officer, formerly an enemy of the state.
Sergei Korolev.
Right, thank God for that.
So, lots and lots of Russian
yeah, there's going to be
names
lots of Russian names that I will pronounce wrong, which I apologise.
Yeah. Really, we should probably stick to doing episodes on basically modern English events.
People with very boring names like our own.
Yeah. If we could just say, look, whatever we're doing, it's going to be about a guy called Dave. And
we just anonymise all the bits.
Yeah.
It's like, so person A did this, person B did that.
Yeah. It was Dave. He lived in Southampton.
Okay, well, von Braun did not come from Southampton and was not called Dave. He was a sort of very young, actually, charismatic rocket scientist, which it sounds a bit strange. When you think of a rocket scientist, you think of sort of a nerdy fellow in specs going, flying me to the moon.
I think of Professor Farnsworth of
exactly, yeah. Yeah, well, he was a bit younger than Farnsworth. So he was only 32 and he was head of the Nazi rocket program.
Oh, that puts us to shame, doesn't it?
It really does, by quite a few years. When have you developed a weapon of death? Come on, get on with it. Von Braun was responsible for developing one of Germany's most scientifically significant objects of the war, and that was the V2 rocket, feared by many Londoners for destroying many of their homes and businesses during the latter stages of the war.
The Doodlebug.
Oh, so Doodlebug was named for the V1.
Oh, the V1. Okay.
This is the V2.
This is a different rocket.
The V2 was actually, it was said you could hear it travelling after it had exploded. It was that fast.
Oh, really?
So you wouldn't hear anything, you'd just hear the explosion.
Yeah.
And he was just responsible for developing this at, I've already forgotten how to pronounce it, Peenemünde, which was on the Baltic coast. It was basically this giant rocket city where loads of German scientists were housed developing these V2 rockets and making sure that basically Hitler had enough of these weapons. Initially, he was a bit like ambivalent about rockets, Hitler, especially as the war sort of started to drag on. But when he was introduced to the V2 and the power of it, he was like, we need to make more of these. We need to, this could be our victory. So he called it the V2 and kind of in a way of naming it sort of their vengeance weapon.
They did have what was that? They had that big Bertha, didn't they? Well, it might have been World War One. It was a rocket. It was so big the launcher had to be put on train tracks.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
First World War.
So basically, they started getting more and more resources poured into this, which led to the creation of something called Mittelwerk, which was a massive slave labour factory dedicated to the construction of V2s. However, as we know, the war went a bit south for Hitler.
Did it? Spoiler.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, everyone.
I was wondering, what's that Hitler guy up to these days?
Somewhere in Argentina.
You don't hear from him anymore, do you?
So by around 1945, you had von Braun getting quite anxious about his rocket city and the team of about 5,000 scientists, engineers, families that had sort of built up around it. They were very concerned that they were going to fall into Russian hands who would be less than kind to them. So obviously they wanted to get out and flee to America as quickly as possible. But it was also because von Braun, he had a very easy childhood, one might say, compared to Korolev. Yeah. He was a wealthy aristocrat. He grew up in like a large country estate where he used to launch rockets at the servants.
So, as you do.
As you do. His parents were actually a bit concerned about him and this habit. So they tried to discourage it by buying him a telescope so he could stare at the stars rather than, cause panic with rockets. It only inflamed his passion to look at space and to get into space. And that was his guiding vision behind getting into rocketry. He didn't really care about making weapons of death. And obviously he was a member of the Nazi Party. He was an SS officer, but he was he always claimed like I was just forced to be. Like I didn't want to be, but it made life easier if, when the head of the SS is saying you need to be a member of the SS, you kind of just say yes. So he'd always had the dream that as soon as the sort of war was winding down, he would flee to America and continue his space program. Because his dream was to not just launch satellites and rockets, he wanted to put man on the moon. He wanted to build space stations that could float around the world and house populations. And, he was very much a sort of big ideas, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke type guy. Ended up trying to write his own scientific novels.
Right.
Got rejected by, I think, about 19 different publishers.
Okay. So he wasn't much of a polymath then.
But he knew his rockets.
Okay.
Knew his rockets. So as basically the war was winding down, you have the Allies encroaching from obviously the west, you had the Russians encroaching from the east, and it was the Americans who reached what was labelled as Rocket City. They reached it first. And so what happened next was that the Americans spent a lot of their time trying to round up as many of von Braun and his work team as possible, as well as getting all the blueprints, all the parts of the V2s they could to take them back to America. Because the V2 was a miracle of engineering. Like, everyone wanted it. So the Americans wanted it, the British wanted it, the French wanted it, the Soviets really wanted it. And luckily enough for the Americans, von Braun had convinced most of his team that they should go to America and they should be part of America. So they found them quite amiable and willing to take part in this. However, von Braun had made his team hide the blueprints in an abandoned mine.
Right.
Because they feared, A, the Soviets would come and take them, B, Hitler had a scorched earth policy by this point, so he didn't want the enemy to have anything of use.
Yeah.
Which obviously led to that famous thing in Paris where he said, just level the city. I don't want them marching into Paris, and the German commander famously saying, it's too beautiful a city to let that happen. So... yeah, so he was also apparently during the end stages of the war, he had about 5 death threats from one German commander saying, "You stay put or I shoot you,"
Right.
and 5 death threats from another German commander saying, "You move or I shoot you."
Right.
So it was like a total chaos around this time for him and his team.
Yeah.
Anyway, the American efforts to sort of round up the V2 scientists was led by a general named Staver. And what made his life difficult was you were sort of approaching around sort of June. The different Allied nations had carved up Germany into different zones. So around about June the 1st, all of the Nordhausen zone, which had all the scientists and the blueprints and all the things, juicy things that everyone wanted, were going to fall strictly into the Soviet occupation.
Right.
However, thankfully, the boundaries kept changing slightly. Staver managed to find the design plans after hunting down some of the ex-teams who managed to then ferret it out themselves after... I think there's one really magical story of he sends this guy called Fleischer to go and find it after grilling him for ages. And Fleischer eventually says, okay, von Braun said, let's hide the plans. But he didn't actually know where they were.
Yeah.
He sort of knew the general area of where they were.
Right.
So he went around just asking townspeople, like, is there a mine around here?
Was Fleischer his real name?
Yeah, it's Fleischer.
It's been a long time since I've done German, but doesn't that mean meat?
As a German expert, I will take your word on it. He was called Karl Fleischer.
Karl Meat.
Call me Carl. He's a great guy. I don't know why I've gone Scottish. Anyway, he goes around this town and eventually bumps into this old man saying, "Have you seen a mine around here?" And the man's like, "Oh, I don't know." And then basically he puts on a little bravado saying, "Look, I'm here for one of the greatest German scientists ever. I need to find these plans before they fall into the hands of the Soviets." And the old man suddenly gets his memory back and says,
okay.
"Oh yeah, the mine's just over there."
Right. Yeah.
So he finds the mine. Fortunately, they find out the mine is based in the British zone, but the British weren't arriving for like a few days. So he has to go back to Staver, get his team to come over and like clear the mine because the caved in front of it. And they managed to literally hours to dig out all the cargo parts and the blueprints that had been hidden by von Braun's team around the V2s and take them back to America.
Right.
So it's incredible. He was also aided by the fact that the boundary lines kept shifting around June, so the Soviets wouldn't occupy the area until the latter end of it. So there was lots of good fortune. And so when the Americans had taken all these parts, these blueprints, they got the American scientists, taken them into the American zone. The Soviets march in, find that Rocket City is basically more or less destroyed. There's nothing there. It's been picked apart by the Americans.
Yeah.
And Stalin's like furious. He's like, I want the V2s. Why have I not got the V2s?
So a member of the NKVD, which was the precursor of the KGB, called General Ivan Serov, was put in charge of this effort. He was a man with a grim past, known for rounding up minority elements. Stalin was, of course, less than pleased, as you mentioned. Worse still, his purges had resulted in any rocket expertise being non-existent on Soviet soil. So the USSR sent the two people left with the best knowledge to try and get the job done. Their names were Chertok and Isiev. Unfortunately, they were only able to find scraps and parts of blueprints after the Americans had taken the bulk of it. They established the Institute Raab in the former mansion of Werner von Braun. Now they set about trying to capture some of the Germans the Americans had absconded with. The wife of Helmut Gottrup, a deputy in guidance and control of rockets, met with Chertok to discuss a deal, mainly because they did not trust or like the Americans, with their chewing gum and hands on the table.
It's outrageous.
I know. But also because Helmut was the only one the Americans would take. The family would stay in Germany under the US contract terms. Soon, he and the family were ferried out into a grand mansion in the Soviet zone. Attempts to capture von Braun were considered too risky, and although one Soviet spy did make an attempt, he soon gave up.
It's quite a funny story of how he tries to get in.
Yeah.
So he crosses into the American zone with do you remember those street hawkers when you were like a kid and they used to open their coats and just have watches and jewelry just lined in their jackets?
Oh, yeah.
That's basically how he did it. He walked around with about 20 wristwatches on his arm and would go up to control checkpoints and go, "Would you like a watch? I passed through for a watch."
Tried to bribe them with watches.
It worked. He got through. He got through and met quite a few American commanders. But in the end concluded that it was too... von Braun didn't want to leave and it was too high risk to get him out.
Yeah, so he would need to smuggle an unwilling von Braun across the border. Yeah, I don't think watches are going to help with that.
Sadly not, no. Remember, he was an aristocrat, von Braun. He didn't need watches.
Slowly the Soviets gathered as many Germans as they could with the promise of good treatment. However, without von Braun, there was a feeling that all would be lost to the Americans. Enter former rocket whiz Sergei Korolev. Korolev had been arrested in June 1938 in a purge and spent years languishing in gulags under the charge of being a counter-revolutionary and a saboteur. His family life was a contrast to von Braun, who was raised in comfort and wealth, while Korolev was raised by his grandparents after his mother left his father. Like von Braun, he was fascinated with flight. At 16, he would go watch the mechanics and planes at Odessa before designing gliders for fun. He ended up becoming an aeronautical engineer and was recruited by the Central Aerohydrodynamics Institute in Moscow. He soon became a rocket enthusiast and joined the group for the investigation of reactive motion with his friend Friedrich Sander.
These are all sterling names for groups.
You look at the name of these sort of groups and institutes set up by the Soviet Union, they all seem to have names like this. Maybe it sounds better in Russian. Korolev was inspired by a man called Tsiolkovsky, who was considered the father of Russian rocket engineering. The group proposed experiments based around Tsiolkovsky's ideas. However, Sander died in March 1933 from typhus, and Korolev took over. Within months, they had launched a liquid-fueled rocket 1,300 feet. This attracted the attention of other scientific groups, and the military saw the possibilities of application. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky established the Reactive Scientific Institute in autumn of 1933, combining Korolev's skills with Valentin Glushok from another research lab who was engaged in rocket fuel research. This experimentation ended with the purges in 1938.
So what's interesting about this is that Glushok would be instrumental in the launch of Sputnik as well because of his work around fuel and designing. And what happened here was that they both kind of got purged in a way, but Glushok, it's funny these names are difficult to pronounce. He denounced Korolev to save his own skin. So that led to a bit of animosity and bad blood between them. But obviously Korolev put a lot of this behind him when he later worked with him. But it was always there in the back of his mind, we used to be friends and I spent a hellish time in gulags because no one around me would stick up for me.
Right.
But yeah.
The Soviet Union had a bit of a habit of purging useful people, from what I remember.
Anyone that could threaten.
Isn't there a bit in Death of Stalin where they're trying to find a doctor to treat Stalin and all the good ones have been purged?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so they round up about 7 or 8 doctors, and they were all like, including one very, very old doctor.
I like him. He comes in and he goes, "Get out the way, you fannies!"
That's his son. Anyway, we're getting off topic. It's a great film. Go and watch it. But yeah, it's so actually related to Death Stalin. One of the main characters in that film is Leverante Berrier, or Berrier, depending on how you want to say it.
Yes.
Who was obviously head of the NKVD and quite rightly feared. He actually came to Korolev's rescue after years of languishing in a camp. He kind of got him moved and retrialed. So they gave him a retrial in Moscow, but they put him in a camp in Siberia.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't lay on any transport for him.
Right.
So he had to travel on his own all the way back to Moscow.
Right.
With no food, no money, and, in the cold winter of Siberia. Miraculously, he managed to make it back to Moscow, where he got a retrial, immediately got put back into prison, had his sentence reduced from 10 years to 8.
Yeah.
So not a great retrial, but he got put to work in like a specialist production department where he could develop electronics and stuff.
Yeah.
And then he eventually wound up in the Central Design Bureau in 1940, and then eventually in a place called Kazan, where he was designing rocket boosters. But it was very tough on him because he had just literally gotten married, had a daughter, and he was wrenched from her in the purges. And he'd been growing estranged from his wife in prison because it was a difficult life. Everything was monitored communication-wise. She couldn't visit him. It's a very difficult life for him personally. But yes, he left Kazan in 1945 with the war's end and was immediately removed from his family again because he was being sent to work in Berlin to decipher the new V2 rockets that they were trying to rebuild.
Right. So he had a pretty rough time of it then.
He did, but he did get an immediate promotion in the Red Army to lieutenant colonel.
Obviously, he worked on the rocket program. Did he do it out of any kind of loyalty to his country, or was it just that this is better than the Gulag?
It's better than the Gulag.
Yeah.
Plus, he always had in his mind, at least in the way the author of the books I've been reading around it paint it, is that both von Braun and Korolev respected and feared each other.
Yeah.
And they both had very similar dreams of they just love space. And if this work helped them to achieve their goal of getting into space, then so be it.
They're basically both passionate rocket engineers who were forced to kind of play along with whatever stupid political situation was going on at the time.
Well, that's it. One of the reoccurring threads throughout the story of the US and the USSR developing their rocket programs in space is that neither side really actually gave two hoots about getting into space. Like they just cared about the rockets and building intercontinental ballistic missiles, particularly with the Americans. So actually one of the great twists and tragedies of von Braun's team. So what they find it, so around this time Korolev is going to Berlin, von Braun's team were being ferried to America, but just the scientists, their families were kind of left behind. They were given these like 6-month contracts to live and work in America because it was quite bad optics for the Americans to invite a load of ex-Nazis to come and live in America and work on their rocket program. Yeah. Something which would persistently dog them as they lived in America for the next few years.
It must have been quite embarrassing that America couldn't produce its own rocket engineers to the standard of the Germans, so they had to bring in Nazis to do the job for them.
Exactly. However, at the same time, America had just developed the atomic bomb and had used it on Hiroshima. So when they brought these scientists over, they weren't as important anymore because they were brought over to end the war more quickly with the development of more V2s, more rockets. But the advent of the atomic bomb kind of there was no longer a massive need for them. However, then they started developing rockets where they wanted to put nuclear weapons in the rocket rather than obviously the payload way they delivered. Was it Big Boy? The one that fell on Hiroshima?
It's Little Boy and...
Fat Man.
Fat
Man, yeah. That's it, sorry. Not Big Boy.
Little Boy and Fat Man. It's what they call us on the street.
Which one is which?
I don't know.
I'm not sure which one I want to be, if I'm perfectly honest. Although, Fat Man Scoop did get a lot of ladies.
I think it sounds like Fat Man's in charge and Little Boy is probably the assistant.
Yeah.
You're probably Fat Man.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah.
That's the less insulting way. So, yeah, they wanted to develop weapons that could carry nuclear weapons further and faster. And both Korolev and von Braun had to contend with this for the next 10 years, basically, with all the top brass going, we don't really give a two hoots about space.
So they wanted to send rockets into space and produce satellites, and the guys in charge were like, no, we just want to blow stuff up. Blow stuff up that's really far away.
Not even necessarily blow stuff up, it's just have it there so that they can use it as a deterrent. So von Braun's team were basically immediately moved to some place called Fort Bliss in Texas, where they were housed in this compound, couldn't go out without a guard, didn't really have anything to do.
They wanted to keep them out the way,
Yeah,
somewhere rural. You don't want them mixing with, I don't know, New Yorkers or something. Or...
They kind of banned them from doing anything,
Right.
anything fun, remotely fun.
Were they considered prisoners of war at this point?
No, they were kind of, because they'd been given like contracts to work and live there.
So sort of international freelancers.
Yeah, it was all a bit weird because they couldn't take their families initially, and most of the Germans were like they wanted longer reassurances. They didn't just want to be. The Germans, von Braun and his team feared that a bit like lemons, they'd be squeezed of all the important information and then thrown out when they weren't useful.
Yeah.
So they didn't necessarily give them all the information they wanted to right away.
Right.
And they were trying to. It was a difficult situation because obviously they didn't want to stay in Germany where it was like a hellhole.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to go to Soviet Russia where they thought it would be worse. So the America offered them the best chance, at least von Braun thought, of achieving the space program.
Yeah, or, achieving is, not being executed or...
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. So there was a lot of suspicion, particularly von Braun, around Mittelwerk as a slave labour camp. So initially he denied all knowledge of working there.
Yeah.
He denied that he didn't know what the conditions were like, and the FBI kind of went, okay, we believe you.
Yeah.
So he escaped. So around the time the Nuremberg trials were going on, there were the sort of Dachau and Nordhausen trials, which were looking at the slave labour camps, and he was vigorously questioned, but he kind of escaped a lot of scrutiny.
He was too useful.
He was useful, but at the same time, he wasn't really useful because the Americans didn't seem to want to use his knowledge. It was a bit weird.
I think it was a pride thing. They were like, no, we'll figure it out ourselves.
Yeah. Well, not necessarily a pride thing. He got off because there wasn't much information. So like he told the story, and him and Dornberger was a German army general who worked with him on the V2 program, and would later actually be incarcerated in the place of the SS officer named Kammerer, who was head of Mittelwerk because they couldn't find Kammerer. So it was like, oh, we can't find him, so we'll imprison the next best person, who happened to be this general who didn't necessarily have as much say over the running of the place.
Right.
But anyway, Dornberger tells this story of, I had to go and rescue him from the Gestapo once because he basically was tried for anti-Nazi crimes.
Yeah.
But there's no record of that. But then again, there's a lot of Gestapo records that were destroyed. So it's difficult to know who's lying. But of course, it then transpired years later that he did know about Mittelwerk and he'd visited it many times.
Yeah.
But he was like, I couldn't do anything. So that was his defense. Like, I knew it was happening, but I was powerless to do anything. Of course, that doesn't excuse him lying about it consistently for like the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, he ended up being a presenter on the Disney Channel, weirdly.
Yeah, that is weird.
Yeah.
Like
the original Carl Sagan. Look at my rockets, everyone.
Did you know?
Yes.
Walt Disney, his favourite thing to have for dinner, do you know what it was?
Was it something Jewish based? Was it bagel?
Well, you're not far off. It was a reheated tin of stew and a cheese sandwich.
What kind of stew?
Like you get like tins of like beef stew.
Wow, really?
I think it's like a bit like the inside of a pucker pie. It's that kind of thing.
God, he'd love Greg's, wouldn't he?
He would love Greg. He'd love a pucker pie, wouldn't he? Put a bit of cheese on that.
So anyway, I'm glossing through quite a lot of it. Yeah, so Korolev heads up this program to basically recreate the V2. So he took a look at the V2 designs they had and actually quickly worked out, actually, there's a lot of things you could improve here. Like one of the things was that the fuel tanks were contained inside a compartment within one section of the rocket. And he said, well, actually, no, you could shift these into the outer layer of the skin to make it the weight balance better. And there were lots of things he could change. But Stalin was like, I want a V2.
Right.
You make a V2.
Okay.
So he said about sort of putting those, he would implement those design changes later on. I think it was also a slightly professional pride for Korolev is that he didn't necessarily want to recreate someone else's work. He wanted to make his own rocket.
Yeah.
Not just a botched job of someone else's rocket, which had a lot of flaws that he saw that could be improved upon.
Well, that makes sense. He was, by all accounts, a passionate engineer.
Yeah, no, he was. By around about sort of 1947-48, he successfully had tested launches of E2s, and they could travel further, and they were lighter because they did make slight adjustments to them. They made the fuel tanks better, the guidance systems better, and he was helped in this a lot by the fellow we mentioned earlier, Guttorop.
Oh, right, yeah.
Whose wife I can't say her name. It's a very German name. You should be able to pronounce this. Irmgard. Immergard. Okay, let's go with that.
Shall we? Oh, I'm going to ask. German.
I don't think we mentioned her name earlier, but it's important to mention her name because she was instrumental in obviously getting her husband over to the Soviet side. So they had actually lived in quite a life of luxury for a while. In fact, she had demanded that they take their cows and dogs into the Soviet zone with them.
Cows and dogs?
Yeah, and they'd shipped them all into Moscow a few years, so basically around sort of the late 1940s, the Allies imposed a no rocket research ban in Germany. So they had to ship all their scientists to Moscow. And so she demanded they take all their livestock with them.
Oh, right.
So once they had proved less than useful, though, they and the rest of the German scientists, once they'd unpacked the V2, got shipped off to like a little island to live out their days in less than fancy surroundings.
Better than the Gulag.
Yeah, better than the Gulag. But then all this sort of 1949 happened, particularly August 1949, and the Soviets had successfully tested their first nuclear weapon.
Right.
Leading to the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Right.
So this is where, as we were mentioning earlier, where the Cold War really sort of kicks off in tensions and things start to get a bit nasty.
Yeah.
Around this time, von Braun had been moved to Alabama, that famous scientific state.
All right.
To the Redstone Arsenal, where he was developing an improved V2 that would carry a nuclear payload. So because the Soviets had developed nuclear weapons, the Americans felt this is an arms race, we need to develop missiles capable of pinpoint targeting Soviet cities with nuclear payloads, because that's what they're going to do.
Because until now, if you wanted to launch a nuclear weapon, you'd have to drop it out of a plane.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a plane could be shot down.
Yes.
I mean, you can shoot a missile down, but if the faster a missile, the V2... It's we sort of slightly glossed over how impressive it was as a missile and how feared it was and how so technologically brilliant it was that every single nation on Earth wanted it and wanted the people behind it. So if you could get a nuclear weapon on a V2, that would be incredible. Yeah, you're away. This rocket that he was improved V2 was eventually called the Redstone rocket, but he wasn't given that much funding for it.
Okay.
He was just given a bit of scraps, and the Soviet funding hadn't been immense because they just didn't have the resources after the war. But in America, it just they didn't seem to just want to give these groups of former Nazis lots of money to work on rockets for some reason.
Well, it must. Yeah, you can imagine that would be quite a delicate situation.
And what's more ironic is that von Braun himself would then go on to be accused of communist during the McCarthy years.
Oh, right. That's quite a 180,
It's quite a swing, isn't it? So, oh, you terrible Nazi. Oh, you terrible commie. And he's just sat there going, oh, Scheiße.
Can't win, can he?
No, he can't win. But around this time, he was getting a bit frustrated. So he would go and give talks about space to local Alabama communities, randomly talking about his dreams of space travel. And then he wrote a series of articles in Collier's magazine. And I think one of the title of the articles was "Man Will Conquer Space."
Right.
Soon.
So he kind of was the Carl Sagan of his day then?
He kind of was. Well, and he basically wrote about all these amazing ideas like space travel, space suits. He predicted men would walk on the moon by 1977. Yeah. So he was right.
Well, it was a couple of years off.
Yeah. More interestingly, he specifically laid out how to orbit a satellite. So he talked about, the ideal trajectory of ideally 1,000 miles above the Earth, moving around 15,000 miles per hour, meaning an orbit of every 2 hours. And he talked about how you do that by launching a rocket off the Earth in 3 stages. And Korolev was reading these magazines across the other side of the world and going, my God, they must be developing a satellite. They must be moving ahead before me.
Right.
All the while not really knowing that von Braun was just sat there in his room not being able to do anything.
So von Braun was just shooting his mouth off.
He was just shooting his mouth off, yeah. But it was inspiring Korolev to shit, I better get a move on.
It must have been so frustrating for von Braun to have all these ideas and all this passion and not to be able to put it into effect.
Well, this is it. He backed it. If he'd gone to the Soviet Union, they desperately wanted to capture him.
Yeah.
If he'd gone to the Soviet Union, he might have actually been working with Korolev, and they might have got the rockets much sooner off the ground.
Yeah.
But instead, he chose the United States, who were like, "You just sit there and do nothing."
Yeah.
And during this time, Korolev was also working with Glushko, who we mentioned earlier, who was obviously they had a strained relationship with, and they came to blows quite frequently. And a lot of the new test rockets he was doing were not lifting off, were not working. So the new iteration of called the R3, it had triple the ton of the thrust compared to, say, the old R2, which was basically a remodified V2.
Yeah.
Was around about 120 tons, whereas the R2 was 35.
Okay.
And that led to just problems in the combustion chamber that Glushko was talking about. So there was lots of different technical reasons that they couldn't overcome, and he wanted to scrap the R3 rocket, which led to fierce opposition from the Russians going, you can't just scrap something we spent years working on. Yeah, and alongside this, his personal life was a bit rubbish as well. His daughter was estranged from him. She wouldn't speak to him.
Right.
So he was quite miserable. By 1953, Russia had mastered the hydrogen bomb, and they wanted the thermonuclear one. And Sakharov, the father of the bomb, in Russia anyway, was urged by Malyashev, who was the defense secretary at the time, he was a leading member of the Russian defense industry. He wanted Sakharov to estimate the weight of a payload that a rocket would need to carry. And Sakharov was like, I don't know, 5 tons? 5 tons?
Right.
And that sort of became the benchmark for payloads.
Right.
Because he was like, 5 tons. I'll leave now. Which obviously, when this was relayed to Korolev, he was like, are you mad? You can barely get 1 ton of rocket. Maybe 3, but 5? So it was becoming a bit stressful for him.
Yeah.
So he set to work on this impossible task with his friend and colleague, Tikhorafov. I think that's how you pronounce it. Whose ideas were incredibly brilliant and wild. So he was talking about grouping boosters and rockets together on top of each other or side by side.
Yeah.
So you get more thrust in one concentrated area. And this led to the new revolutionary design of the R7 because, if they'd just been the R3, this was going to be like 5 times better. So it'd be the R7.
Right. It's a bit like, we don't need Windows 9, 7, 8, 10.
So this would basically see one gigantic rocket with a core of 4 central booster rockets strapped around it. And then 5 engines, one on the core and others on the boosters, which would all be multi-chambered, which would solve the pressure and the mixing thing, because you'd have loads of little mini engines mixing all at the same time.
Yeah.
And this would create a thrust of 390 tons, 9 times more powerful than any other Soviet rocket. So as I said, by multi-chambering it, they solved the issue of trying to scale up conventional combustion.
Yeah.
As with volume, you get instability and pressure.
Right.
So by making them separate and all fueled by one pump, it would be a sort of a powerful engine akin to 20 V2s.
However, this success depended on liquid oxygen fuel man Glushko, who had a rocky relationship with Korolev since the purges we mentioned earlier. He was envious of Korolev's success, but also didn't want to build the steering engines. His colleague Mishin had designed fearing that they would fail, and he didn't want that attached to him. Nonetheless, Korolev pitched to the military, who immediately went, "Cool, love a big rocket," and named its product, the very catchy name, 8K71. However, he had not forgotten his dream of launching a satellite and tried to sneak it in as a proposal, only to be continually shut down by the higher-ups.
I imagine you just went, can I make a satellite? No. Can I make a satellite? No.
I have that at work. I'll be given a project and I'll be like, can I use this really interesting new bit of technology? No, you can't. We do it this. And you try and sneak it in sideways.
Yeah.
But anyway, in August 1953, at the shiny new Cape Canaveral in Florida, chosen for its barren and lifeless aesthetic, do you think the local estate agents would agree with that?
That's how I'd sell it if I was.
Yeah. Barren and lifeless. I would quite like barren and lifeless. At least you'd have to talk to the neighbours.
Well, there aren't any neighbours, exactly.
Yeah. But anyway, von Braun watched his Redstone rocket launch end in spectacular failure due to a guidance system error. It did launch a few months later, but their budget was slashed again shortly after the cessation of the Korean War. It seemed most American top brass were only concerned with rockets as weapons and not space travel. The promise of America was waning, At the 1952 annual symposium on space travel, Van Braun used examples of floating space stations and spy satellites as examples of war deterrence to try and entice the US to change tack. The Navy, whose rocket team was headed by Milton Rosen, were creating Viking, a rocket to study the atmosphere. Rosen publicly criticised von Braun in Time magazine and said that von Braun was unrealistic and his pie-in-the-sky ideas had a negative impact on the US rocket program.
So just to clarify this, whereas in the Soviet Union you had one centralized rocket program basically going on, in the US you had the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and they were all kind of independently developing their own rockets.
Right.
So there was like, it was a weird thing going on where they all kind of were in competition with each other. But I suppose it's that American ideal of like, we need competition to make the best type of thing, rather than everyone working together to make the best thing.
It does sum it up quite well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So von Braun's team was in danger of breaking up. 9 years since they fled the war-torn homeland, the promises of scientific development had dried up. The commercial sector began to poach members of his team, despite Braun's attempts to convince them not to. His brother Magnus even left to join Chrysler, and von Braun himself considered leaving only to have it rejected.
I suppose technically he wrote a series of threatening letters to the US government saying, look, if you don't give me what I want, I'm leaving. I'm taking my stuff and I'm going. And they were like, shut up.
Oh, okay.
so you know, but they weren't made public, his attempts to resign.
No, it sort of doesn't sit well alongside that whole land of the free thing, does it? If you're kind of keeping German rocket scientists against their will.
Yeah. Well, they were still technically German. They would actually, in recent weeks to come, take up their citizenship for a very good reason. Because in 1954, in June, a telephone call changed everything.
Right.
Commander George Hoover of the Office of Naval Research wanted to put a satellite into space. Finally, someone wanted to do the thing that von Braun had been wanting to do for years.
Ah,
It was incredible.
that's lucky, isn't it?
Mm.
So he might have asked him to make a vacuum cleaner.
Wonder if there's any relation.
Next episode.
America would be part of the International Geophysical Year, which was basically this huge international collaborative scientific project that would culminate and mark the 11-year sunspot cycle.
Okay.
So it would reach its peak around 1957. Eisenhower, meanwhile, had sort of established this sort of secret panel to address fears around Soviet missile development, because all the while, obviously, Korolev and other teams in the Soviet Union were accelerating their development of nuclear weapons, of missiles, and it was really putting the frighteners into the Americans. He wanted to actually create a spy satellite, similar to what von Braun had sort of pontificated in his 1952 conference speech. But the IGY would also provide perfect cover to launch it. Because it would be... So a lot of different historians have ideas around this, and they sort of... Some come to the consensus that Eisenhower was really attached to this idea of freedom of space.
Yeah.
So, you know how nations have boundaries?
Yeah.
So we can't fish too far to the east because we'll go into Danish or Norwegian waters or Swedish waters.
Yeah.
So they wanted to understand if this concept applied upwards.
Right.
So not just airspace, like physically the space above the planet.
Yeah.
So he wanted to establish the freedom of space, which meant that anyone could just move around the Earth however they wanted, which would be great for a spy satellite.
Yeah.
And the IGY would provide this sort of perfect cover to launch a spy satellite under this precedent. But as we mentioned, instead of getting all his teams to work together to create the perfect rocket, to create the perfect satellite, he put it out to tender between them.
Right.
He said, whoever can come up with the best rocket pitch gets the job. Each member of the armed forces had a bid. So the Air Force wanted to use the most powerful missile they had in their armory, which was the Atlas missile.
Yeah.
But the outer shell was so thin, it had massive pressure problems and would just never get off the ground to take a satellite up.
Yeah.
The Navy, as mentioned, you mentioned Milton's Navy. Such a funny name, Milton, isn't it? Had the sort of Vanguard rocket, they called it, based on the Viking rocket, which had been used to already photograph space. So they had a bit of precedent.
Yeah.
And it could only reach an altitude of 150 miles, though. So they needed to massively redevelop it to get it into space. Von Braun was very confident his Redstone rocket could touch space. And he was so confident that during the pitch speech, he just waffled on about how brilliant the Redstone rocket was for ages and how brilliant his team was, confident that they would pick him.
Well, I don't know if we covered this. Was von Braun, was he affiliated with any of the armed forces in America?
Yeah, he was part of the army.
He was the army.
He was part of the army. So
Right.
the army had taken him and the German scientists away.
Oh, okay.
So and of course, when it came to the the bid, which bid they chose,
yeah,
who did they end up choosing?
the waffly German man.
No.
Oh.
In August 1955, the Committee on Special Capabilities voted for the Navy.
Oh, okay.
The top brass had massive concerns over the amount of power the army had
Yeah.
in the US forces, not least because it was a modified German rocket that had been used to bomb thousands and thousands of people in Europe,
Yeah.
led by a former Nazi whose
Yeah.
team were mostly made up of Germans.
Yes.
So there was an optics issue.
Yeah.
Van Braun was obviously aghast
Mm.
and even begged to be like a backup option. He said, "Let me continue working in case it doesn't work out with the Navy."
Mm.
To which they said, "No,
Okay.
no, you're not doing that." Instead, they were told to develop a new rocket and were barred from working on satellites.
Oh, okay.
So this new rocket was called the Jupiter. They also wanted to make sure the rocket could enter the atmosphere and come back down without having any significant damage. Meanwhile, Korolev
Mm.
was in the harsh surroundings of the beautiful Kazakhstan desert with the extremely cold winters and extremely dry and arid summers
Yes.
in a secret launch site far away from prying eyes.
Mm.
The site, although grim, was Tyra Tam and was soon transformed into this small working military town.
This is like one of those towns that springs up around a coal mine.
Yeah. So it was built entirely around the sort of rocket effort. So 1 million cubic feet of concrete was required alone for the launch pad. So one thing actually I forgot to mention was when Eisenhower pitted these various US forces against each other,
Yeah.
he publicly made the announcement that he wanted to launch a satellite himself, what he called a second moon, which immediately sparked the Soviets into a frenzy going, "Oh crap, we better build something to outfox the Americans."
Oh, okay. This was Korolev's moment. So on the 30th of January 1956, the Soviet leadership approved the satellite creation plan, initially named Object D. Khrushchev even came to visit the institute in Moscow and was wowed by a full-scale replica of the R-7. Korolev gave assurances that missile development would not be impacted by the satellite, and wooed by promises of one-upping the Americans, Khrushchev gave the thumbs up. Regardless of what the Americans thought, von Braun still harboured plans to secretly launch his own satellite. The Jupiter C was due a test launch, and the top brass insisted that there would be no accidental satellites and made them fill the top stage with sand. Its firing set a new record of 682 miles in height and 3,335 miles long at 1,600 miles per hour. The launch frightened Korolev, who felt it was a failed satellite attempt. There were still problems to work through, including their own nose cone issue, as well as guidance systems to be developed. But the main thing was Glushko's chambered engines. Tests were showing that there would not be enough energy to reach orbit because acceleration in relation to fuel consumption was low.
The actual satellite the Soviets wanted to put on top of the R-7, which we've referred to as Object D, again, snappy name, it was just taking its time to build because different institutes around Russia were sort of involved in creating it. So nice collaboration, but also no communication.
Right, okay.
And they basically wanted to stuff so much stuff inside it that it would be impossible to send it up because it would be too heavy. So, cosmic ray measurements, magnetic field equipment, how to measure the density of the Earth, all this sort of stuff that was important and essential for the IGY, but you never get it off the ground. So after months of sort of fannying about, Korolev eventually just went, "Look, you are delaying me. Send me what you have. We'll assemble it here and stick it on the rocket." There's a funny story about the person who goes to collect it. So the driver that was sent to collect it had a hearty breakfast of industrial alcohol.
Okay,
Quite a lot of industrial alcohol. He drove like a madman to pick it up and then on the way back crashed into a tree.
Okay, yeah.
Miraculously, it survived. So it was a good shock test.
Yeah.
So when it was unpacked in front of Korolev and Tikhonravov, they came up with a rather simple yet brilliant solution. Why not just build a smaller, lighter one rather than cram all this crap into it?
Oh, that's an idea, isn't it?
Yeah. And instead of all these scientific equipment, why not just put in a simple radio transmitter? It would still be a satellite. People would be able to tune in and hear it, and it would still establish Soviet dominance in space because they would be the first to launch it.
Yeah.
All the other scientific stuff could come later when they worked out different weight sizes, different payloads. Simple, brilliant, and exactly what they did. The rocket itself, interestingly enough, they initially wanted to assemble it vertically.
Yeah.
And realised that would be too much to do. So they built the hangar to assemble it horizontally. And what they would do is they would then sort of manoeuvre it and then just lift it up. So the massive concrete pad that they'd built, designed by another one of his colleagues, Mission, who we mentioned earlier, or Mishin, would mean the rocket would be actually suspended in air. So it wouldn't actually be lifting off from the ground. It would be held just above the ground. It was suspended in the air by these 4 massive metal pads that looked shaped almost like tulips.
Yeah.
Within the frame of these sort of pads was the fueling system as well. So it was a very clever design. He didn't actually have permission for this yet, though, to scrap the original Object D satellite. But thankfully, in February 1957, as things were sort of ramping up and noise out in America was ramping up towards the IGY, they were putting out loads of promotional campaigns about how great the Navy rocket was, when really it was just behind schedule.
Right.
And not doing well. The Russians were like, shit, got to do this.
Yeah.
So in February 1957, he received his permission to build the smaller satellite, which would become Sputnik, confident that the Soviets would win the race. So, but just to bear in mind that it had taken less than 3 years to go from like the R2, R3 to the R7 rocket, which is an incredible amount of time for development.
Yeah.
So they'd already busting their backs to get these rockets to work, and they'd gone through so many on both sides, so many failed launches and tests.
They did cheat a bit, and they did skip R3 through 6.
Well, they didn't cheat. They just decided to develop something infinitely better straight away. A bit like having the iPhone 10 before the iPhone 3, whatever it is.
I think didn't they call it an iPhone X, and then they're like, no, numbers are best. We'll go back to numbers.
Yeah. But like I said, there were a number of failures. So in June alone, there were 3 successive launch failures from the 9th to the 11th of June.
Were those publicised?
No. But they kept trying. And then eventually, on the 21st of August, 1957, they succeeded in launching the R7 successfully to the height they needed, without a satellite on it.
Yeah.
And of course, Korolev was very relieved.
Yeah. She would be.
So now everything was geared towards the next launch, which would be Sputnik, on the very early days of October.
So the Russian word Sputnik is derived from the word put, which means a way or path. And the prefix S means co, and the suffix nik makes it a person. So it literally means co-wayfarer. It's quite nice. But Sputnik itself was not a very complex device. It was a metal sphere weighing about 85 kilograms. It had 4 antennas and a radio transmitter that sent out beeps that could be heard by anyone with a radio receiver. As you mentioned, the Sputnik, being the satellite that was actually launched in the end, had no scientific instruments on board to save on weight, but it did measure the density of the upper atmosphere by its orbital decay. The launch was successful, and Sputnik reached an orbit with an apogee of 940 kilometres and a perigee of 230 kilometres. It circled the Earth every 96 minutes and remained in orbit until January 4th, 1958, when it burned up in the atmosphere. Sputnik's radio signal was picked up by amateur radio operators and scientists around the world who tracked its position and speed. Sputnik also caused a lot of public interest and curiosity, as people could see it as a bright star moving across the night sky.
So, this tiny metal ball, not bigger than various different balls that we use every day in different sports applications.
A medium-sized ball.
A medium-sized ball beat for 22 days, then fell silent and crashed to Earth a few months later. So after years of both sides making these giant proclamations about we will launch satellites into space, we will conquer the stars, it was Russia who did it first. And they did it on October the 4th in style, because this was midway through an IGY international conference specifically on rocketry.
It's a great PR move.
It's a great PR move. The conference was called the Committee Spécial de l'Année Géophysique Internationale. It's my bad French. Or the CSAGI.
Yeah.
A 6-day event exclusively on rocket and satellite research, held in Washington, D.C. of all places. And during the opening session on the 30th of September, when the event kicked off, Soviet delegate Sergei Poliskov began his presentation titled Sputnik and dropped a massive hint that it would be launching soon and broadcasting on a set of frequencies, actually ones outside the ones established by the IGY. So the international ruling body had established you had to transmit on 108 megacycles.
Yeah.
Sputnik would do 20 to 40.
Okay.
And of course, like, the Americans in the room were like, nah, that can't be true.
It's like an Apple announcement.
Yeah, no, that can't be true. And so when it launched on October the 4th and the news came through, the conference erupted into a celebration. Even the Americans were like, oh my God, there's something in space. Mankind has put something in space. The chairman of the US IGY program even called it fantastic publicly.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was he a scientist?
Yeah.
You feel like...
Well, this is it. All the scientists were like, this is great, but they were terrified the public would fear it.
I mean, one thing you can take from this, I mean, going back to, von Braun and the Nazis, is that the scientists just seem to be kind of above or whatever's going on politically. They just want to do their thing. They just want to put rockets in space.
Well, they did, but at the same time, von Braun I think von Braun and Korolev really did see themselves as rivals and were trying to sort of one-up each other. In fact, von Braun at the time was...
He was unhappy about this, was he?
He was quite unhappy, yeah. So he was actually attending a dinner at the same time as the new Defense Secretary of the United States, who he then immediately, upon hearing the news, set out trying to persuade him to let him do his own satellite and then desperately reclaim some of the US credibility, saying that the Navy had failed. We could have done this months ago. You've got to give it to us. It's funny, though, because the only advantage the West could claim was the fact that everyone in the West heard the news of the launch before anyone in the Soviet Union did, other than the top brass of the Soviet Union. Public reaction was incredible across the world and mixed in so many different ways. You had the Chinese saying this proves communism is superior, and different other sort of fears were also ignited by the British and the Europeans, who greatly feared Russia was becoming a superpower that would destroy them. So it led to increased ties in NATO.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, it's a good day for the Soviets, but the launch of Sputnik shocked and surprised many in the West, including in America, where many had assumed that they were ahead of the Soviets in technology and science. Sputnik also raised fears and concerns about the Soviet military capabilities and intentions, as well as the security and prestige of the United States. The launch of Sputnik triggered a series of political, military, technological and educational reforms in the US, aimed at catching up with and surpassing the Soviets in space. The US government also responded to Sputnik by increasing its funding and support for research and development, especially in aerospace, defense and nuclear fields. They created new agencies and programs such as NASA, DARPA, the NDEA and ICBM to advance its space and missile technology. They encouraged more students to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, as they were seen to be lacking as the Soviets had managed to overtake them. Sputnik stimulated the imagination and creativity of many artists, writers, filmmakers and musicians.
Sputnik was apparently directly responsible for Stephen King's sense of dread in his novels.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What, the beeping, was it?
Yeah, but also the fact that the Sputnik orbited the Earth every, I think, 96 minutes.
Yeah.
So it went over America quite a few times a day, and the American people were just scared that it might do something to them.
I do hear a lot of the feedback from them was that it was seen as a very ominous thing to hear this beeping coming on the radio. There are a couple of more positive things. So there was a famous song at the time called Beep Beep by an artist called Louis Bega, released in 1958, which featured a beeping sound, which was intended to sound very similar to that of Sputnik. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in 1987, Bega said that he was inspired to write the song after seeing Sputnik in the sky. He said, "I was just amazed by it. It was so small, and yet it was up there, circling the Earth. It was like a little piece of the future." So not universally feared, but...
Well, you say that, but there were some religious leaders who referred to it as the second coming of Christ, and the world would end.
Would you feel with them any opportunity to predict the beginning of the end?
Well, apparently even, I don't know how true this is, according to one website I read, a rock star Little Richard even gave up singing to become a preacher for a short amount of time.
Oh, because of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the most important thing it did was create this anxious technological gap the US was now perceived to have against the USSR, which directly led to the US public actively going, here, take our money, take us into space.
Yeah.
They didn't care anymore about paying high taxes to get into space, which directly sort of led to Kennedy sort of sweeping into power and saying, I'll put a man on the moon.
So while Sputnik was an embarrassment to the American people, it probably was the kick up the arse they needed.
Yes.
To get them into the space age.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Back in the Soviet Union, Sputnik was followed by 2 more satellites in the same series. Sputnik 2, which carried the dog Laika, who was the first living creature in space, and Sputnik 3, which carried 12 scientific instruments to study the upper atmosphere and space. The Soviets also launched other satellites with different names and purposes, such as Venera 1, which was the first probe to Venus, and Mars 1, which was the first probe to... Can you guess where that one went?
Is it Jupiter?
No, it went to Mars.
Oh, well, I failed that question.
I'm not sure. I assume they mean the planet and not the factory in Slough.
I sincerely hope not. So yes, eventually von Braun did get his way, and he and his team, using the Jupiter C rocket they were developing, managed to launch Explorer 1 at the end of January 1958. So shortly after the Sputnik came crashing down to Earth.
Oh, okay.
So the Americans immediately fought back. And off the back of this, they then went on to create NASA, which we all know would go on to do lots of incredible things in space.
Yeah. And then, of course, this rivalry eventually led to the first human in space, who was Yuri Gagarin, and later on to the moon landing, Apollo 11.
And that's the story of Sputnik.
Yeah.
Tale of a lot of annoyance and tapping your feet and wanting to launch lots of rockets and being told not to.
Yeah, so it wasn't an easy feat. It involved a lot of politics and I guess a lot of science as well. And as they say, one small beep for Sputnik, one giant leap for mankind. Now, it's the bit that I think you've been looking forward to.
I can go home.
No, you cannot go home.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
It's time for the quiz.
Can I go home and do the quiz?
No, you can't. So, Nick, this is the Sputnik quiz. Are you ready?
Duh.
You have no lifelines.
No. Duh.
You never had one. I just thought I'd remind you. The first question. Are you?
It's flashbacks to school when people say, you have no life.
Yeah. First question we'll be firing towards you is, which fun piece of beach paraphernalia was Sputnik roughly the same size as? I'm going to give you some options for each one, as is tradition.
I mean, the answer's in the question.
As is tradition. Was it A, child's bucket? Was it B,
dear.
a beach ball? Was it C, a lobster pot? Or was it D, a cornetto?
That's impressive because we only usually have 3 multiple choice answers. So
Well,
I love the fact that we've got 4.
I've gone all out this time.
Right, okay, it's a beach ball.
It is a beach ball. Sputnik 1. Approximately the same size as a beach ball, about 58 centimetres wide, but it weighed 83 kilos, which would be a lot.
Was it cornetto, did you say? I mean, the end of a cornetto is kind of round.
It would be. It's more of a rocket shape, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yes, but the Sputnik weighed 83 kilos, so you wouldn't want to take it to the beach.
Well, unless you were doing a bit of bodybuilding.
Unless you're doing some bodybuilding, yeah. But moving on. One out of 1 so far. Good. Your next question.
Right, okay.
Sputnik's successor.
Is this one going to have the answer in the question as well?
I thought I'd start you off easy.
Right, okay.
Sputnik's successor, Sputnik 2, is famous for carrying the first living creature into space. This was a stray dog who was found on the streets of Moscow and given the name Laika. What does Laika mean in English? Is it A, lady? Is it B, fluffy? Is it C, Janet? Or is it D, Barker?
I honestly don't know. All I can think of is the cameras. I'm going to go lady.
Lady. No, it was Barker. The name was given to her by the technicians due to her
Barker?
loud barking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I've got one wrong.
I think it's the first, isn't it?
Well, yes. Legally wrong, anyway. It's not made up rubbish like last time.
We made up rubbish.
Gooses, indeed. Okay, it's good to learn something.
Yeah, like, I mean,
And that's why you. The only mark of a good quiz is when you come away learning something.
Yes. So you've learned the Russian word for Barker. So here you go. Next question. The Americans came to refer to all USSR satellites for a period of time as Sputniks, leading to the nickname Sputnik being given to the failed launch of America's own first satellite, Vanguard TV3. What does Sputnik, however, coincidentally refer to? So is it A, an unknown flying object? Is it B, a helmet worn by a cosmonaut? Is it C, a Russian tradition? Or is it D, the hometown of lead designer Sergei Korolev?
Well, it's not D. I don't think it's a helmet based on what I know the arrangement of Sputnik's words to mean.
Mm-hmm.
What Russian tradition?
Russian tradition.
Well, and the first one was an unknown flying object.
Yeah.
I'd say C.
C. You're right. Kapustnik is a Russian celebration involving songs and cabbage pies.
Well, yeah, it kind of, because obviously Sputnik meant something like Traveller of Roma or something. So it had to be something...
About cabbages.
Yeah.
Yeah, because...
it had to be something like...
I mean, it doesn't even sound like Sputnik. It sounds
feel,
like Kaputnik.
You're doing a good job. I feel tense.
You didn't see that one coming, did you?
I didn't know.
Does it make you angry that it's a stupid question?
I'm more angry at the fact that there's 4 possible answers rather than 3. I'm going to give you 6 possible answers.
Okay, good. I like it. Okay, next one.
Yes. Fire away.
Right. Sputnik was launched at what is known today as Baikonur Cosmodrome, located in the town of Baikonur, in Kazakhstan. It remained the primary launch site for the USSR and Russia to this day, and has been leased by Russia from Kazakhstan until 2050. How much is this costing Russia per year? Is it A, 1 ruble? Is it B, 100 million rubles? Is it C, 800 million rubles? Or is it D, 9 billion rubles?
I have no idea. 1 just seems obscenely stupid. But it could be one of those like legacy things.
They're
where
very
like,
friendly, aren't they, Russia and Kazakhstan?
Well, they weren't friendly. They oppressed them for quite a few years. I generally don't know. I can't see them paying 9 billion for it.
The lease was signed on the 8th of June 2005.
Okay, 8th of June 2005. I'm going to say C again.
No, it was 9 billion rubles,
Okay.
which makes it about 115 million US dollars.
Okay.
It's a special enclave of Russian territory within Kazakhstan, meaning that foreign visitors need a Russian visa to enter.
Okay. I severely undervalued the site. This massive desert site in the middle of nowhere.
I can't imagine that you'd want to go there on your holidays.
Well, unless you like space.
Unless you like space. I'd probably go to Kennedy Space Centre if I was into that sort of thing.
Okay.
Rather than the barren deserts of the Central Asian steppe.
You wouldn't go to Cape Canaveral. You just go to Disneyland.
I've been to Cape Canaveral.
Have you?
Yeah.
What was it like?
I was like 14, so I don't know. A lot of it was lost on me. I was there for the rides.
What, the rocket rides?
No, it's really close to Disney World.
Yeah. So you went on Space Mountain, I imagine.
Went on Space Mountain.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, of course.
Or was an actual rocket site? You went,
Nah, Space Mountain. That's great.
Mm.
Here's the last one. Let's see if you can redeem yourself.
Yeah.
Sputnik famously launched on the 4th of October 1957. What other historical, possibly related event happened on this day? So there's a little clue for you there. So is it A, the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight?
Mm-hmm.
Is it B, the TV premiere of the sitcom Leave It to Beaver? Is it C, the birth of popular astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson? Or is it D, the first flight of the de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jetliner?
It's actually Leave It to Beaver.
You're right. The TV sitcom Leave It to Beaver premiered on CBS.
I saw your red herring.
The series ran for 6 years and was eventually adapted to a to an unsuccessful film on the 22nd of August, 1997.
I'm sorry, did you want me to put more suspense into that answer? Hang on.
I think you're due an easy answer.
I read it in 3 separate books.
Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah, and I was just like, why is this important? Why does that matter that Leave It to Beaver was...
I was the same thing. I saw it mentioned in several different sources, and I thought, well, clearly this needs to be in the quiz.
Yeah, 3 out of 5, not bad, considering you've increased the answer range.
I thought it was a pretty solid quiz.
You forgot, didn't you?
No, that's why there's 4. If I'd forgot, there would be 3. But I thought, no, we're going to give him something else to work with.
Well, I'm not going to be horrible, so the next quiz will still be 3. But
Okay.
they will be ridiculously hard.
Will they be?
Yes.
Will they be?
I will make them so catastrophically hard it will make academics weep.
Right. Okay.
Other than that, good quiz, well done.
Much like the American space industry, I may not be first, but I will do a better job of it second time round. That was our episode on Sputnik. I hope you found it interesting, engaging, uplifting.
That's very clever, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
We've already used that about 3 times over the course of the episode.
But yes, thank you for listening from my co-host Sputnik and me, Sputwill.
This is just your chance to actually use the Russian you introduced the podcast with.
Yes, as always, please do subscribe and let us know your feedback. Here's the clue for what our next episode will be about.
The lift that leaves you with a nice warm glow.